To see by show of hands, who in the room regards themselves as a reasonable person? The vast majority. Excellent. The vast majority of you regard yourself as reasonable people, and I think that's a wonderful and positive attribute. We all want to be seen to be reasonable. Here's the problem with reasonable. Unreasonable people abuse you. So I want to challenge your notion of reasonable and unreasonable, and I want to use some tools this afternoon, before I send you on your way home, to help you reframe the way you treat governments, the way in which you treat risk, and think more deeply about the challenges that not only your industry faces, but the challenges that your industry imposes on the whole economy. I say not George Bernard Shaw, because George Bernard Shaw spoke about the reasonable man, and we don't do that anymore. The reasonable person adapts to the world, the unreasonable one persists in adapting the world to themselves, therefore all progress depends on the unreasonable person. I want to play a game called reasonable or unreasonable bingo. I'm going to put up an image of a person on screen, and in your loudest voice, I want you to shout out, reasonable or unreasonable. The rules are quite simple. Unreasonable, absolutely correct. Now, Jeremy Maggs was my first boss, and he was a lovely boss. Until the day he sent me on my first ever reporting job. And he said, Bruce Hyde, you're a bit short, I was freelancing at the time, would you mind going to cover an event for us? Now, bear in mind, this is 1993. And the events that he wanted to cover was in Vereeniging. And it involved a man called Eugene Terreblanche. And I naturally agreed, because this was a breakthrough. What he didn't tell me is the reason I was being asked to do it was because the guy who usually covered the AWB had been beaten to a pulp the week before by the AWB. Now, had he furnished me with all of the facts, would I still have gone? Yes, I would have, because I'm not a reasonable person. But had I chosen to not go to that event, my career may have changed, may not have followed the path that it has followed. So I am grateful to him for being sent to see Eugene Terreblanche. Once was enough. I got away with it because I grew up on a farm in the Free State, and I could not do what is pretending to be one of them. Okay, so that was an easy one. This one becomes a little trickier. Reasonable or unreasonable? My father. Ooh, silence. Awkwardness. Was Bruce beaten up as a child? Was his feet held to the coals? Was he sent to boarding school at the age of 4? Was 7? Yes, I was. But what made my father unreasonable was he could teach you all a thing or two about risk. Because every year for 60 years, he would plough furrows in clay soil of the Free State and put, in today's money, millions of rand into these furrows in the ground with fertilizer, cover them up, in the belief that the plants would sprout, that they would seed to germinate, the plants would sprout, that they would be healthy, and in August of every year, he would be able to harvest a crop. And that worked most of the time. Early in the 1980s, there was a drought. Okay, tap on, wipe out all of last year's profits. Year 2, replant, there is a drought. Year 3, replant, there is a drought. By year 4, lots of neighbours are not planting because they've learned the lesson. They're reasonable people. They're going to wait until certainty returns. My father plows furrows into the harder ground than it was last year, plants the seeds and covers them up, and has one of the best harvests ever. As what he believed would eventually happen, we return to a cyclical norm, and it was well rewarded because many of his neighbours had not planted, prices went up, and he managed to make up for the losses of at least 2 of the previous years. And that ability to govern risk and have risk frameworks is a really important thing in every aspect of our lives. And my father, in that respect, a deeply unreasonable person. In every other respect, perfectly okay. This is going to be interesting. Reasonable or unreasonable? I feel the life being sucked out of me. Reasonable or unreasonable? Come on. Unreasonable, a perfectly sensible answer. Imagine coming out of jail after 27 years and saying, okay, everybody, I know it's been a rough 350 years so far, but I think we can make it better. Can we just, let most of our Bibles be Bibles and can we just be nice to each other? Quite an unreasonable request. What would a risk manager have said to this guy on the day he walked into Parliament with a speech that says, we're not giving up, we're not surrendering to hit guns. 1940 after Dunkirk, World War II, his war cabinet is advising him to negotiate peaceful terms. Winston Churchill refuses. A risk manager would have gone, Prime Minister, can we not say blood, tears, toil and sweat? It's a bit violent. Can we say we'll try really hard? We'll do our best. No. He assessed the risk of fascism and said it must be literate, deeply unreasonable. By now I think you get the trend, deeply unreasonable. I want you as my followers to go to the imperial forces and be beaten to a pulp and to take them, and eventually we will outmass them and they will leave India. Mahatma Gandhi. Astonishing cases of unreasonable behavior in the face of impossible odds. Yet, by taking big risk, they go down in history as superheroes. In Renui, now the last time I spoke to her, forgive me for a second here, I just need to digress. You are going to get the sense that I'm a bit of a name dropper. Because I have had the privilege over many, many years of going into rooms at the World Economic Forum, of being introduced and sharing stages with some really fantastic people. The last time I spoke to Renui, as Ashley said, was the chief executive of PepsiCo, and we had a lovely chat. We spoke about decisions and decision making, but she was very clear in that she was transforming PepsiCo from a diabetes, not a diabetes business, as he's implied, but yes, to a healthier range of alternatives, taking some quite big risks within PepsiCo to reframe it. What was the choice? To go down a path of continual criticism and losing market share, or to broaden your product suite. You can't just think about risk as today's problem or the decisions that you make. You're really making long-term decisions. And as I think about name dropping, it's like the last time I spoke to Richard Branson, and he said that he introduced Nelson Mandela to the Dalai Lama. Now that's name dropping, right? So I'm not name dropping, just put it there. But 30 years ago, this was the most useful thing ever. In fact, the more of the stuff you had, the cooler you were. The more friends you had, because they wanted to come to your house and see your stuff. And it took a deeply unreasonable person in the form of Steve Jobs to eradicate that norm. What was absolutely acceptable 30 years ago is unacceptable today. And he was quite mean about it. It was really tough to work with. You read Walter Isaacson book and Steve Jobs was not a nice man. But he revolutionized our world in ways that we could never have imagined. And his job wasn't to ease on people, his job was to make them better. So how do you, as risk professionals, make people better? Better at taking risk, better at assessing risk, and not being caught up permanently in fear, but finding ways to seek opportunity more effectively. Because today we take this for granted. The fact that the world is in the palm of our hands. One of my favorite quotes, and I think he said it to me, but negative people never build anything. And the risk of risk is that we're so busy looking at the scary stuff that we forget that there's a whole big world around us that actually is far more open to opportunity than we might think. And I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about this. This is not risk, all right? Now we have all your arrows, says the king in the field of dead soldiers. That is not optimism. That is not the kind of optimism we need in our world. We need a more pragmatic optimism, an optimism that says we can fix the future, things can be made better. So how do we do it? I wrote a book, and I was reminded earlier of the trauma of book writing, published in 2020, called The Upside of Down. And it's informed my thinking consistently since then about the way in which we treat our environment. You can either be grim and miserable about it, or you can seize the opportunity that it brings for you. And that's what I want to challenge you to do. That how, in a world where there are various, and this is not specific to anyone, but a bunch of despots and lunatics and fruitcakes and scary people in the world who have the power of life and death not only over our economies but over real lives. I feel like I've missed someone.
Yeah.
There's no special mention. And the world right now is buckling under the huge uncertainty of tariffs. Huge uncertainty. The most beautiful word in the dictionary. I didn't know what the dictionary was. But this uncertainty that Trump brings is something that you've got to navigate. But because there is no pattern or plan other than chaos, it becomes really difficult to do. So I made a list of the scariest things in the world right now. I read your risk report, it's lovely. It feels very similar to Glass 10. Sorry. Because these are real risks. These big global risks, right? I don't think anybody could argue against any one of those. Here's the irony, I haven't updated it for the last 4 years. Because you don't need to, because this is the world in which we live. So if this is the world in which we live, this is normal. Therefore, is it really risk in the way in which it is framed? I would argue we need to broaden our understanding of what risk is. Researchers at Penn State University, I spoke to people who were agonized and full of anguish and worried about everything, and came to this statistic that 91.4%, could be more, could be less, of our worst fears never come true. So while we are warning people about all of these bad things that are real, and you have to protect yourself against these bad things, are we doing them a favor, or are we constraining them? This magazine cover came out in about October, November of 2019. It was the year ahead, 2020. Nowhere on that cover, or in that publication, will you find the words COVID-19. No. Because as Morgan Housel puts it, his book saying as ever, risk is what you don't see. The thing that is going to unsettle each and every single one of you in your careers is something you would never have dreamed of. And that's why it's scary. Because you cannot know everything. What is the next word? This is the tool, by the way. What is the next word in this sentence? I'm not a pessimist, but it's my favorite thing. I'm not a pessimist, but. And throughout my career, this is not Jeremy's fault, even though he trained me and taught me everything I know. When I got to do my own radio show and did it for 21 years, I thought my job was to create entertainment, which, yes, inspired it. But I also didn't really understand what I was doing. I was talking to people with IQs considerably more elevated than mine, who knew their businesses considerably better than I would. So I thought the easiest way for me to get away with this, and it worked for a long time, because deep down satisfied, was to challenge. So somebody would come on and say, I found a new way of doing risk. And I go, yes, that's interesting. But, and then I find something to demean their big idea. And I force them onto the defensive. And I discovered over time that but is the most dangerous three-letter word in the English language. How many times have you woken up in the morning after having a 2 a.m. epiphany, this sort of thing, an idea? And you may even, because you are risk professionals, have rolled over and written it down on a pad or paper or sent yourself a little note on your phone and gone, that's a good idea, and slept beautifully for the rest of the night. Woken up in the morning and gone, oh, that's wonderful. I love my idea that I had at 2 o'clock this morning. Oh, but we'll get through the daily grind. But it's expensive, but it is too risky, but. You see, but becomes this terrible roadblock. But becomes this enormous roadblock. And what I discovered in years of interviewing people, that by challenging them with but, I was shutting down conversations. I wasn't learning anything. I wasn't advancing the conversation. In fact, what I thought was a perfectly sensible, unreasonable behavior was not nearly as effective as I would have hoped for. And I'll come back to this one in a moment. Imagine flying an aeroplane, and you take off from, I forget which airport it was, JFK, one of the New York airports, and suddenly fly through a flock of geese, and you lose both your engines. It's the stuff the pilots are trained for, but never believe will happen. Chelsea Sullenberger has two potential airports he can go to in New York City and makes the decision to ditch in the Hudson. You haven't seen Tom Hanks movie where he plays Chelsea Sullenberger? It's great. Because he has second guessed for months after making a decision that saved the life of every single person on board. And his point on risk is you cannot foresee every scenario. You can't anticipate every scenario. There is not a checklist for everything. It's impossible. You asked earlier about Steinhoff. One, and this was told to me privately, so I can't disclose who told me this, but one Monday morning, an executive was in their office and one of their fellow executives was uncharacteristically late. And so, are you late? Oh no, I'm going to England for the weekend. Well, that's nice. The calculator said, yes, on Friday, you're back here on Monday, that was a whistle stop. No, we went shooting with Marcus. Marcus who? Marcus Houston. What kind of shooting? Well, it was brilliant actually, because he flew us first class. They said they had first class in those days. They said they had aeroplanes in those days. And routes and international routes anyway. Still like risk. And this guy had been on a shooting weekend with Marcus Houston. And had been flown first class, had been put up in beautiful boutique hotels in the English countryside, had been given all of the gear you need to appear to be like an English country gentleman who's going out shooting, had been given 2 Purdy shotguns, which he was complaining about because he had to then go through a whole customs process to bring his own shotguns back to South Africa. And we get at the time of calculation to be about 250,000 rand a person. And the wise executive in this point said, well, that's really just so glad you had a nice weekend. So cheers to the less wise executive. And immediately followed his work and said, sell all my sandwiches. He didn't need a risk report. He didn't need a spreadsheet. He didn't need a positive and negative column. He just needed to know that the ethics of the leader of the business in which he was invested were not underlined with his own. He said, I cannot put an investment in somebody who treats shareholder money like that. How many of you would have changed the view on a sign-off on something so ephemeral, something so simple? And it took about 6 or 7 years for it to be proven right. And it's those sorts of signals in the world that are much more positive. So instead of using but in every conversation, I started using a 3-letter word, a different one. And I found this to be the most unreasonable of all. Because in using but and shutting down conversations and putting people onto the defensive, you're not asking them to expand their idea, you're not asking them to share more detail. You're not learning anything. They are not able to express themselves clearly if you're constantly going yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. And it becomes quite a conflicted environment. And I want to demonstrate this to you, and I haven't told our lovely AV people at the back, but they're impeccably well prepared, and I'm sure they've got the volume of this next slide elevated. 3, 2, 1. Somebody's pushed it up, I hope. Excellent! Listen, when you have buts, that happens. This is an and conversation. When you put the barrier of but into the discussion, immediately there's something. This goes on for 90 minutes, and I'll stay. But and is this incredible lever when you are exploring complexity, when you're exploring difficult topics, when you don't understand something and you're looking for a proper explanation, and you have doubt in somebody's integrity or what somebody is doing, by forcing them to extrapolate further and further and further, you can come to one of 2 conclusions. Either this person is brilliant, or this person doesn't know what they're doing. And as a lever, is a fundamental linguistic tool that we can all use each and every single day. Because Daniel Pink is an American psychologist, and there are not too many Americans that we respect at the moment, but he's one we can respect. talks about how problem solvers, and you ultimately are all problem solvers, the issue of risk is probably one of the biggest problems of our generation, is they don't limit their thinking. It's not a but process, it's an and process, it's an expansion process. I'll give you a couple of examples. 20 years ago, Lego was almost bust. And they got into collaborations. They got into working with others. So now Lego sets, and again, we've seen in this room, most rooms, men of a certain age, with children of a certain age, are not yet ready for the Lego sets that the fathers buy them, but the fathers buy them anyway, buy Lego. And I see wry smiles, which are admissions of guilt in this particular case. They're serious, and it's fine, because you know it's true. Women don't do this sort of thing, but they do, because they want to pay for the Lego. But you can have legacy, and you can have innovation. You don't have to have one or the other. You can have, for example, growth and sustainability. Patagonia, one of my favorite tales. Yvonne Schoonow, Canadian mountain climber, wanted more sustainable, better quality clothes and sick of the throwaway culture of fast fashion. So he created Patagonia as this outdoor brand. And it made him a billionaire at all terms. One day he picked up Forbes magazine, he was horrified that he was a $1 They said, "Oh, this family together." And said, "Look, we've got enough money. Let's give away the business in the name of sustainability." So they put the business into a trust, and the profits from that trust go to fighting climate change. And Patagonia, as a result, continues to deliver superb clothing and delivers positive outcomes for the environment. Can we do risk and opportunity? Now, this is a great opportunity for me to showcase a brand new book that I just co-authored with my friend Professor Adrian Savile Gibbs. And it's about Time Bank, a South African startup that has had 7 near-death experiences in its life. And one of those near-death experiences came about as a result of governance. And the failure of governance at one of the world's biggest banks, Australia's CBC. You can tell I've been traumatized by writing the book. But this Australian bank buys time, because it loves the technology that time has developed, and it wants to take that technology and apply it to Southeast Asia, where it is expanding. Commonwealth Bank of Australia, CBA. And they buy the bank, and immediately sideline the founders. They take Koen Jonker, the CEO, and they put it in their Southeast Asia operations, and he does very well, and he improves their Southeast Asia operations so much so that they're offering a job on the Group Exco and a cushy job in Sydney. The rest of the team sits in South Africa going, we were building this thing and it was going really well, and now we're owned by these Australians who brought in 60 risk professionals and put them into the office in South Africa before they were even had banking license. I don't know what they were doing. And this was their corporate governance standard. Now the great irony of this, of course, was the board was terribly worried about this little bank in South Africa that they paid $40 million for. Terribly worried. So it sent teams of people to manage the process. They even sent ergonomic specialists to teach staff how to sit in their chairs, which cost about $2,500 each. They then decided the chairs weren't good enough and upgraded those chairs to $10,000 chairs. And then brought those ergonomic specialists back to teach people how to sit in the nicer chairs. And then they were worried about the sun coming through, the harsh African sun coming through the windows, so banned anybody from sitting in the sunlight unless they were wearing sunscreen. At the same time, there was a huge investigation going on into Commonwealth Bank of Australia for selling products to dead people. For complete and utter governance failures that cost the entire board ultimately their jobs, the chief executive his job, because they were constantly looking at the wrong spaces. One of the Times' great breakthroughs, of course, is that this kiosk model, which they put into Kiwi Group stores and Boxer stores and Pick and Pay stores, each one of those stores is staffed by an ambassador. The board of Commonwealth Bank of Australia went, well, we can't own that business because these people have to take a minibus taxi from their homes to the normal where they're going to be working for the day, and if they get hurt in a taxi accident, people will criticize us. So they're sold it off and then outsourced to that particular division. Their focus was in completely the wrong place. Time was later then brought out of Commonwealth Bank of Australia African Rainbow Capital. I won't ruin the story for you. If Stephen King was to read this book, the King of Horror writing, it would keep him awake at night, based on the sort of activity there. But they were looking in all of the wrong places in the way in which they were governing this little outpost, which ultimately they missed out on a huge opportunity in changing the world. That's our belief anyway. And the world actually isn't that complicated. You've got three sort of main cycles. There's the now, which is everyday news, the politics and the sport and the business, Fifi and others too. And this is urgency to know everything happening now. And that's the stuff that scares you when you wake up in the morning and you go, okay, what do we have to be worried about today? In the fullness of time, most of what you're worried about today is not going to happen. What we should really be more concerned about really is the paradigm shifts that are happening over long periods of time. Things like the end of the Cold War, the opening up of China, the expansion of the world, the loss of American dominance eventually. And then, of course, the really scary stuff, climate, demographics, the stuff that is actually the big risk, that we're not looking at because it feels so far away. My friend Lord Cameron Moria, I told you it was a name dropper, started something called Cobra Beer. Born in India, educated at Cambridge, liked a curry over the evening, couldn't find a beer that matched it, so started Cobra Beer. Fantastic podcast called The Art of Deciding, which you should all listen to. It's a podcast that I do. But I was talking to him about the fact that we are so overwhelmed by information. We are so drowned in information, it's really hard to see what does and does not matter. And he said, well, the true superpower is seeing what everybody else sees, because we all have access to the same information. It's how we choose to frame that information that is the difference between those who get stuck in the risk rut and those who fly. See what everybody else sees and think what nobody else is thinking. Why is it that entrepreneurial organizations are growing exponentially? Because they choose not to be burdened by legacy systems. This is something called the World Uncertainty Index. It was started in 1990. Berlin Wall had just come down, and as you can tell by the little green arrow that's about to go off the charts there, the world has not been as uncertain since the Berlin Wall fell as it is today. And I'll give you some demonstrations as to why that is. In episode 1 of the Art of Deciding podcast, Lee Child, the founder and creator of Jack Reacher. Lee Child is the king of risk. He gets fired from his TV job in the 1990s at Granada Television. 7 of his other senior managers who have the same sort of level as him also get fired. The 7 of them go off and go find other jobs at lower rates than most of them, but paid less than they would be paid previously. Lee Child goes home and says, good news, dear, I've lost my job. She goes, that's wonderful news, darling. Now you can do that thing you always wanted to do. He said, yes, I'm going to write a bestseller. He sits down and writes his first Jack Reacher novel. At 24 books, he got quite comfortable of Jack Reacher. And he said to his younger brother, you take over the family franchise, and I'm going to kill this guy. You're going to bleed to death on a filthy motel room floor if you don't take him over. And Andrew, his younger brother, is now on book 29. But Jack Reacher has sold more than $1.5 billion worth of books. Now, Lee Child could have gone and sort of found a job. He could have had the certainty, he could have had the security. He went, I can still do that if this doesn't work. Life's full of risks. It's up to you to decide which ones are worth taking. So if I was to give you $1 in 1990, well, it's maybe before we started, $100. So the journalist coming down. In 1990, now said you invest it on the S&P 500 index or put it into US Treasuries. Now I can guarantee you 4% a year compounded over the period of this investment, over 35 years. You can't cash it in before the 2nd of October 2025, so that's today. You can either put it into the certainty of that, or you can put it into the S&P 500. I must warn you, however, a lot of bad stuff is going to happen between 1990 and 2025. There's going to be a period between about 2008 and 2015 where you're going to lose money. So your returns are going to be corroded. And here's something bad things that can happen, is that they go forward. And then people then get airplanes and fly to the World Trade Center, and that's going to spark another invasion of the Middle East. And that's going to lead to all kinds of catastrophes, ultimately a global financial crisis when risk fails and greedy people rip the wing out of the financial system and almost break the financial system. And you know what's going to happen next? We're going to have a weak credit crisis, and the whole European Union could fall apart. And then Britain's going to leave the European Union, and that could lead to another situation where the world falls apart. And then there's going to be COVID, it's a pandemic, it's like 1919, and more than 6 million people are going to die. And then Ukraine's going to be invaded, and then we're going to have Gaza. And then Donald Trump is going to come back as President of the United States again. So where did you invest? With certainty, or did you take risk? Knowing Yuval Harari talks about a true superpower means knowing what to ignore, not what to pay attention to. But in this world where there is so much information, Karen Memoria, see what nobody else sees, see what everyone sees, think what everybody else dares think. Now being able to ignore the noise and the clutter. Because the magic of the world is human development and ingenuity, unconstrained by really tight risk management, is this thin blue line. That thin blue line is the S&P 500. I'm going to do it like an auction. I'm going to ask you, in percentage terms, what has the S&P 500 returned from the 2nd of January, markets closed on the 1st, 2nd of January 1990, to yesterday? Don't ask me what the S&P 500 is going to do today, because I'm not going to. In percentage terms, who will start me off? I can't hear you. People in the front. Give me a sample. Sorry? 200x. What's in percentage terms? 2,000%. I also want gin and tonic for breakfast. So that's a very good way to start your day. I recommend it. Auctions are have to start at a reasonable level. Don't be unreasonable in this particular instance. Everywhere else be unreasonable. 1,000%. We can get 1,000%. I've got 1,000%. Anybody willing to give me advance of 1,000%? Give me advance of 1,000%. 1,700%. You're close, actually. If you put dividends, if you reinvest the dividends, you've got 3,000. So it's not a bad guess. It's the best guess I've ever had. The compound annual growth rate is 10.7%. And that means $1 invested in 1990 is worth $18 today. That same dollar, at 4% a year compound, would give you certainty, $4. The biggest risk is taking no risk at all. Jeff Bezos. People overestimate risk and underestimate opportunity. And how often do you do that? And the problem with having just a risk framework that looks at the scary stuff is that you don't get a complete perspective. And if you're only looking at it through one lens, you're not going to get the full picture. That's where and comes in. This wonderful lever. And what are we missing? And what opportunity are we missing? And what will happen if we do this? And thinking embraces complexity. It allows you to take diverse perspectives and not all think in the same way in which you have been schooled and trained for so long. You have to be able to embrace trade-offs. You have to have a deep and unquestioned curiosity about the world and about human development and progress. And ask yourself this question with a police interrogator called Asbjørn Ratu. What is the opposite is true? I believe all of this to be true, and I have my biases and everything I've ever been trained tells me that this is true, but what if the opposite is true? He learned this when he interrogated Anders Breivik, a Nazi son who killed 76 young people on an island in Norway, 15 years ago. It took him 9 months to interrogate Anders Breivik, because Anders Breivik claimed that he was one of many, many right-wing cells across Europe who were about to rise up and cause havoc everywhere. It took them 9 months to be absolutely certain that they weren't sitting on a really serious timeline. And Asbjørn Ratu is fundamentally this. I know what I believe, I know this guy's been guilty, I suspect he is still in But what if the opposite is true? So when you're developing your frameworks, when you're challenging yourselves, when you're challenging your colleagues, what if the opposite is true? I was inspired, and not many people would say this, Secretary Donald Trump would say this, I was inspired by a central bank governor's speech. The best central bank governor in the world was voted by his peers in 2021. This is Jeff Netanyahu. He gave a speech in July 2021, and he went, when everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. And I contacted him and I said, what do you mean? He said, what did you think I meant? Don't be such a central banker. Why was a central banker? And I said to him, I think he meant that South Africa needs to focus more narrowly on the issues that exist. We're trying to do too many things at once. We're trying to fix everything at once. We went, if that is your view, I will not contradict it. So I said, is that yes in central bank speak? He said, well, how do you mean? What do you mean? Central bank is already hard to do that. So this time last year, in fact, 366 days ago, I published this book called The One Thing. I asked 120 people, I said, give you 500 words on one thing you would do if you were president for half an hour, and you would do only one thing to change the future of South Africa positively. And I got these wonderful responses. And among them was this desperate plea for decency in a desperately unfair country. This desperate need for growth in an unfair country. This desperate need for jobs in an unfair country. And how many of the decisions that you're making on a daily basis are constraining growth versus liberating growth? And I'm not suggesting that we all go to the casino and put money on that already. But can we flex a little? Be a little less restrictive and controlling, I wonder. And my wife said to me as I proposed this idea to her, she said, well, you know, you're going to have one thing as well. I said, I've got it. She said, what is it? So I told her. And she said, you can't do that. I said, but I want to. And she said, you can't. And we know how this ends, right? I went, okay, I'll get outside referees. I'll get two women, the publisher and the chief executive of Town Women. And my wife knows them both, and knows them to be good and upstanding citizens. And I had Terry and Andrea on a video call, and I said, lean into your cameras, please. And they said, what is your one thing? And I said, I need to tell you my one thing. And if you even blink or wince or even show any sign of weakness, I won't do it. And they said, yes. And I said, but first I have to tell you a story. A completely true story. About how I was walking down Bancroft Street in Cape Town on a February morning, trying to find an address. And you know, who's from Cape Town? Yes, you people hate outsiders. And I know this with good reasons, most of them. You take all of the numbers of all of the buildings, and then you don't put any cell phone towers in the nearby, so Google Maps doesn't work. So when you are trying at a 40-degree February morning at 10 o'clock, and you're sweating through your suit, trying to find the address of the place you've got to be at in 10 minutes, you feel a bit stressed. And at that point you realize, why for 2 minutes? Nobody likes 2 minutes. Right. And I was about to capitulate and phone Google Maps and say, please help. When this vision appeared down the street. And February is also Models Month in Cape Town. And she was completely unfazed by the heat. She was completely unfazed by the fact that there was more heat coming up from the road than there was coming down from the sky. There was no southeast of that day to cool things down, yet there was a breeze blowing through her hair. And that odd, but not weird. So I've had to reconstruct the moment. It was a bit like that. This beautiful woman walking towards me, and because my mother was very good on reading, she told me, said, my boy, whenever you see words, read the words. So I looked at her chest, because she had a slogan across her chest. And it had this prescient message, and it was the message that I would like you to take away with you this afternoon. And I stopped her and I said, if I told you I love that slogan on your t-shirt, would it make you need what your t-shirt says? And she says, well, it all depends on how you think. So I said, well, I think it could replace every law in the country. I think it could replace the rules of the road. I think it could replace the King Code and corporate governance, at which point she got bored and walked away. And then went, yeah, no, that's fine. Weirdo. And off she went. So if you take away nothing else, take away this one thing. Your neighbor, that's who she really is. I'm not going to say it because my wife told me I may not. And you inside out, thank you very, very much.